Systems don't break with alarms. They drift off course in places nobody checks twice. Inside reports, inside totals, inside numbers that look clean enough to pass. A budget closes, a signature goes on the line, a report gets filed, and the assumption settles in. If it balances, it must be fine. That assumption held for years. Right up until someone decided to stop trusting the summary and trace the math from start to finish. That someone was Thomas Massie. When he walked into the hearing, nothing about the room signaled disruption. Across from him, Pam Bondi had already moved through hours of questioning with practiced control. Measured answers, careful pivots, no openings left exposed long enough to matter. It was working, the way it usually works, until the conversation stopped being about language and started being about numbers. Massie didn't change the temperature of the room. He didn't press harder, didn't interrupt, didn't escalate. He simply narrowed the focus. Instead of debating conclusions, he began laying out inputs. Yearly budget figures, one after another, calm and precise. On the surface, everything aligned exactly the way it should. 1.2 billion, 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion. Nothing controversial, nothing unstable. The kind of sequence that reassures you the system is functioning. And for a moment, it looked like this would pass like every other exchange that day. Then he shifted direction. He brought up the Special Victims Fund, a pool of money created under state law, fed by fines from criminal cases, intended for people already harmed, trafficking survivors, assault victims, families waiting for compensation tied directly to documented cases. This wasn't background noise in a budget. It was supposed to be a direct line between enforcement and recovery. He asked how much money had gone into that fund over 8 years. Bondi paused. Not long, but long enough. Massie filled in the gap. $2.4 billion. The room stayed still. That number on its own didn't create tension. It fit the scale of everything else they'd been discussing. Then came the follow-up. How much was spent? The response came back less exact, more flexible. The kind of answer that usually survives because nobody forces it into alignment with the original figure. Massie did. He gave the precise total, $1.553 billion. At that point, the structure was already in place. All that remained was to connect the numbers. He entered them into the calculator, right there on the table. No commentary, no buildup. Pressed once. 847 million. No one reacted immediately, because numbers don't shock you until you understand what they mean. Massie didn't explain it. He didn't need to. He looked up, held the result in place, and asked the only question left. Where did it go? No abstraction, no framing, just a gap large enough that it couldn't hide behind process anymore. And in that moment, the entire hearing shifted. Because the system that had been running smoothly for hours was now facing a number it should have been able to explain, and couldn't. The question didn't echo. It settled. And that's the difference between a political exchange and a structural failure, when a question lands and nothing moves to meet it. Pam Bondi didn't rush to fill the silence. She leaned slightly forward, eyes shifting, processing, calculating not the number, but the consequences of answering it. Because at that point, the math was already public. The only thing left was accountability. Massie didn't interrupt the silence. Thomas Massie understood something most people in that room didn't. Pressure isn't created by raising your voice, it's created by removing every exit. He reached into his pocket, placed his phone on the table, and opened the stopwatch. No announcement, no explanation. Just a quiet, deliberate action that changed the rules of the room. The timer started. At first, it didn't register. A few seconds passed, the kind that usually disappear between words. Bondi glanced toward her counsel, a reflex more than a decision. The lawyer leaned in, whispered something brief, something careful, something designed to buy time without committing to anything that could be pinned down later. But time was now visible. 10 seconds. The cameras didn't cut. Journalists stopped typing mid-sentence, waiting to see whether this would resolve or collapse. The rest of the committee shifted in their seats, not dramatically, just enough to signal discomfort. Because everyone in that room understood what was happening, even if nobody said it out loud. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't theatrics. This was a measurement. 20 seconds. Bondi's hands came together on the table, fingers interlocked, thumbs pressing against each other. A small gesture, but one that shows up when control starts to slip. She leaned toward her microphone, then stopped short, as if testing a sentence in her head and rejecting it before it reached the air. Whatever explanation existed wasn't ready. 30 seconds. Massie didn't move. He didn't look down at the timer. He didn't look away either. He held the space exactly as it was, allowing the silence to do what no question could, force a response that either existed or didn't. 40 seconds. The chairman shifted, glanced down the table, considering whether to intervene, whether to restore the rhythm of the hearing before it broke completely. But there was no procedural violation here. A question had been asked. An answer had not been given. 50 seconds. Bondi reached for her water, lifted the glass, took a small sip. The movement was controlled, but the delay was obvious. Not a reset, just a pause that didn't solve anything, because the number was still there. 847 million doesn't dissolve if you wait long enough. 60 seconds. At this point, the silence had weight. It wasn't empty anymore. It carried everything that hadn't been said, every missing document, every untracked transfer, every gap that should have been explained before this moment ever happened. Then, finally, she leaned into the microphone. There are details in the budget reports. Massie cut in, not loudly, but precisely, the way you stop a sentence before it becomes a shield. Which line? No anger, no escalation. Just a demand for specificity that the situation couldn't support. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't a delay tactic. This wasn't strategy. There was no answer ready. Massie reached forward, stopped the timer, and turned the screen outward. 65 seconds. He didn't comment on it. He didn't need to. Because in a room built on words, 65 seconds of silence said more than any answer could have. The silence didn't end the exchange. It exposed it. Because once a number survives the question, the next step isn't debate, it's documentation. Thomas Massie didn't raise his voice after stopping the timer. He reached back into the file. And this is where the hearing crossed from pressure into proof. He placed a document on the table, turned it just enough for the room to see the header. Florida Auditor General, year 2020. Length, 157 pages. Title, Special Victims Fund Analysis. No speculation. No partisan framing. An audit. Massie didn't summarize it. He read it. Out loud. The introduction alone was enough to change the tone of the room. 18 months of investigation. 234 documents reviewed. 47 interviews conducted across departments and agencies tied to the fund. That isn't a quick review. That's a forensic process. And the conclusion didn't arrive as a theory. It arrived as a limitation. The money could not be fully traced. That phrase matters, because it doesn't mean the money was misplaced in a minor accounting error. It means the system designed to track it failed to do so. Massie moved through the findings one by one. The first possibility, transfers into the general fund. Estimated value, hundreds of millions. But no formal transfer records, no approvals, no signatures tying those movements to authorized decisions. The second, redistribution to other departments. Again, large sums. Again, no receiving records that could confirm where the money landed. The third, payments to outside organizations. A category that, if legitimate, should be backed by contracts, invoices, service documentation. None of that appeared in the audit trail. The final portion wasn't categorized at all. It simply had no trace. Each path led to the same point. A number that existed in intake, partially existed in spending, and then disappeared inside the system without documentation to explain the difference. Massie didn't exaggerate any of it. He didn't need to. He entered each segment into the calculator again, rebuilding the total piece by piece until it reached the same figure. 847 million. Not approximate, not disputed, reconstructed from every available angle. He looked back at Pam Bondi, and this time the question wasn't about calculation. It was about responsibility. You were the Attorney General, he said, steady, controlled. This department operated under your authority. Bondi began to respond, shifting the frame toward operational complexity, toward the reality that large systems involve layers of management, multiple actors, delegated responsibilities. Massie didn't challenge the complexity. He narrowed it. Your name was on the office. The fund was under that office. That distinction matters. Because complexity can explain delay. It can explain inefficiency. It cannot explain the absence of a record where a record is required. This is the part most people miss. The issue isn't that $847 million is unaccounted for in conversation. It's that, according to the audit, it's unaccounted for in documentation. No transfer logs, no receiving confirmations, no contractual proof. And without those, there is no mechanism inside the system to justify where the money went. Massie closed the file slightly, not to end the exchange, but to contain it. Because by that point, the structure of the argument was complete. Input verified. Output verified. Gap identified. Audit confirms the gap cannot be explained with existing records. At that stage, the burden doesn't sit with the question. It shifts entirely onto the answer. And in that room, in that moment, the answer still didn't exist. And this is where the story stops being about arithmetic and starts carrying weight. Because $847 million isn't just a discrepancy sitting inside a report. It represents obligations that were supposed to move outward, toward people already harmed. People who don't appear in hearings and don't have time to wait for systems to correct themselves. Every dollar in that fund was tied to a case, to a name, to a moment when the state stepped in and said, "We will handle this. We will follow through." When that chain breaks, the damage doesn't stay inside accounting. It lands somewhere, and it lands on someone. Thomas Massie never had to draw that picture explicitly. He let the structure do it. Input verified, output verified, gap established, audit confirming that the gap isn't supported by records that can explain it. Once that framework is in place, the question changes. It's no longer, is there a problem, but who is responsible for resolving it? Pam Bondi moved on to the next topics as the hearing continued, answering in the same steady tone that had carried her through the earlier hours. But the room didn't reset. You could see it in the way attention shifted, in the way conversations in the back row didn't follow the new questions, in the way analysts outside the room started circling back to a single number instead of the broader agenda. Because once a figure like that becomes visible, it doesn't fade into the background. It anchors everything around it. The audit had already done its part before that day ever began. 18 months of review, hundreds of documents, dozens of interviews, all narrowing toward the same limitation. The system couldn't fully trace the movement of those funds. That finding doesn't accuse. It doesn't speculate. It establishes a boundary, what can be verified and what cannot. And that boundary is where trust lives or breaks. Because a system built on law depends on something more basic than authority. It depends on traceability. If money enters under legal mandate and exits without a record that connects point A to point B, then the mechanism designed to ensure accountability has already failed before anyone asks a question about it. At that point, the issue isn't how well someone answers in a hearing. It's whether the structure itself is still capable of producing answers. That's why this moment extends beyond a single exchange. It forces a decision, not from the people at the table, but from everyone watching. Do you accept a gap of that size as something that can be explained later, somewhere else, by someone else? Or do you treat it as a signal that something fundamental needs to be addressed now, while the numbers are still on the table and the record is still open? Because ignoring it doesn't close it. It just moves it out of view. Massie didn't try to frame that decision for the audience. He didn't need to. He showed the inputs, showed the outputs, and left the difference sitting there, unresolved, but fully visible. And once you've seen that kind of gap, you can't unsee it. So now the question shifts to you. When the system can't connect its own numbers, do you assume the explanation exists somewhere off-screen? Or do you ask why it wasn't there when it mattered? If you think this kind of breakdown deserves attention, stay with this channel. Like, share, and subscribe. Because the next time the math doesn't hold, we're going to follow it again, all the way through.